Good morning, everyone. My name is Brian Henderson. I run a company called wildmotion. I worked at Red for the last 13 years until a couple months ago. Got kind of bit by a nature bug, and now I work mostly with nature and documentary filmmakers. A lot of you are on this call. But Reducation is something that is near and dear to me. I started it in 2008. Our first class was at LA Center Studios, and Bill Donaruma was one of our attendees. So we've been doing Reducation now for a long time, and we thought we would do a little taste of Reducation, highlighting our instructors and kind of going over Komodo-X. You guys are going to introduce yourselves, right? So I'll just kick that off and say, I'll be in the chat most of the time with Jill Johnson from Red. So if you have any questions, put them there and we'll gather them all for the end. I think we have a pretty packed agenda, but we're reserved about 20 minutes at the end for Q&A. The people on this call right now are very experienced operators and filmmakers. So throw your questions in there. Jill and I will do our best to answer them. And I'll just go ahead and hand the baton off to Bill.
All right, thanks everybody for joining in. This is our kind of Komodo-X special edition, going over the Red ecosystem, but kind of an overview of what this camera is. It is a light overview. We're talking about, we do a very much bigger, deeper dive into a lot of the settings. We'll leave some of that to questions. So we're going to kind of work our way through the core elements, I think, of what we cover. And I'm going to give you kind of a look at, how that will proceed. I'm going to share my screen. You should be able to see all of us plus this, right? All right, so this is X. So we plan on doing just a quick introduction of ourselves, where we're, what we do, where we're coming from, maybe what our specialties are. We're going to do, Ivan and I are going to do a little overview of exposure dynamics, just because it's a little bit different with Red systems, and then do a Komodo-X overview, kind of, what's the body like, what are some of the differences between X and the regular Komodo, how it might relate to, I think the bigger systems and even with Raptor. We're going to jump into communication settings by the end. And Christine's going to talk us through a little fun trick that we have in store, where we're going to send video from Frame.io. I'm going to record a little video here and send it into Frame.io through a connection that she has there in LA. And she's going to take it over into a post-production overview, because I know a lot of people have questions about that. We have a little video. We're going to meet Keaton, who's on the call now, but he's been very busy the last couple of days. And he's got a little video of how to rig up a camera to a motorcycle. And that, again, we spent a lot more time doing that in our live and online sessions. And then making sure that we have enough time for Q&A at the end, because a lot of questions in that way. So we met Brian, right, who is our team leader and runs wildmotion. And we are the instructors for today. So Ivan, you want to take it over? And probably a lot of people know Ivan from his reputation, but go ahead and tell us.
I hope they know me. For my reputation. Hi, my name is Ivan Agerton. I'm a DP based out of Seattle, Washington, and I have I've been part of Reducation since 2009 with the Red One, starting with the Red One, and obviously we worked through the whole ecosystem up until now, and taught these cameras up until now. I am primarily a documentary filmmaker. I also do a little bit of wildlife. I've worked with National Geographic Society, and done a little bit of work with a company called Ocean-X, working on underwater shooting. And yeah, glad you guys are all here.
Yeah, so a wide range of specialties too. So it'll be fun that way. We also should say that we're not Red employees. I have some Red swag, but we're not employees of Red. We just used Red and use them in different ways, and been around for a while. So we have kind of a different perspective, I guess, on things. I'm Bill Donaruma. I'm a filmmaking professor at the University of Notre Dame. So I'm in Northern Indiana right now. I also make a lot of documentary film, but I do a lot of things that probably a lot of you do. So I've done music videos and feature and short films. I actually teach mostly narrative filmmaking and lighting, cinematography. And I've been around since, I guess that first Red class. I teach it here. Gone through a lot of the iterations of all the cameras, and now I'm fortunate enough to have gotten my hands on Komodo-X, and we have a Raptor. So I just took Komodo-X out on a shoot in southern Italy last month for a week, so got my hands on it for that time. And Aaron's going to certainly, I think, has more hands-on experience moving forward, so we're going to hear more about that. But Christine?
Hey, you guys. I'm Christine Steele. I'm based in Los Angeles. I'm an Adobe master trainer for Adobe Premiere, and I've taught at a lot of different places, from UCLA, guest teaching at USC. I speak yearly at the National Association of Broadcasters Conference, Sundance, sometimes South by, the different film festivals, and the Adobe Max Creativity Conference. So you can catch some classes there. I am also a documentary filmmaker, and I've been shooting my documentaries on Red, but I usually hire amazing cinematographers like these guys. So I produce and direct. My background is in post-production. I began my career as an assistant editor at Pixar in animation, and then it was a natural transition to want to edit documentaries as well as animation, because they're built in a really similar way, where it's story first and then you build the pictures to it. But I started my directing career in documentaries about a decade ago, and that's when I connected with Brian at Red and started hiring Red cinematographers. So I made the decision that maybe, like some of you, I wanted to get a lot more proficient with the Red cameras. And I'm really here to share with you some of my post techniques, especially the new cool feature of utilizing camera to cloud to directly send your footage into post without having to transcode or transfer it.
Yeah, we're really lucky to have Christine on board. I should also say I shoot, but I also do all my post-production work myself, and I'm doing a lot of colorist work now too. So I'm using primarily Resolve now. So we'll be able to hopefully answer more of those questions down the line as well. Aaron.
Yeah. My name is Aaron Baggenstos. I'm based in Seattle. I am a wildlife photographer and filmmaker. I've been traveling the world extensively for around a decade, and just fallen in love with the world's wild places so much that my real passion has become around conservation. So I do a lot of conservation work. I also find it incredibly fulfilling to share these passions with other photographers. I train a lot of photographers and filmmakers. And what drew me to the Red ecosystem was the community. I found that the most incredible human beings on earth organize around these cameras. And I'm just so excited to be part of this community and join the conversation about this incredible camera.
Yeah, and Aaron's been fortunate enough to, I think, use probably Komodo-X more so than anyone we have on a panel right now. So he's going to be chiming in a lot with things that, as we're working through, hey, this is really good things to know as we're hopping through the menus and stuff. Keaton, we're going to see Keaton's video later. He's going to have to break away, but Keaton, tell us about yourself and what they'll get out of coming to see us live sometime.
Awesome. How's it going, guys? I'm Keaton Bowlby. I run a company up in Lake Tahoe, Reno, Nevada, called Ascending Works, where we play with cameras. We have Russian arms and drones, and we rig cameras to bikes and motorcycles. And I basically live in the automotive world. Currently, right now, we're on a feature that you guys will get to see here in the next 6 months, but we're on overnights right now. So I actually just got back home from last night's shoot, and then we load back in at 5 p.m. tonight. So I'm going to dip out, but I recorded a short video for you guys on just how to rig to that electric e-bike over there. A Komodo. It's a super quick, short version of what you would see in the live course. So take a look at that, enjoy it, enjoy class, and hopefully I get to see some of you guys in the person one someday.
Yeah, Keaton's our specialist in all parts that he's tried out, and remote control options, and does a lot of the hands-on stuff that we don't always get to play with. So it's always good to have them around. All right, go get some rest, buddy.
Thanks, guys. Enjoy class.
See you, bud.
So first, Ivan and I want to just jump through. I'm sure all of you, many of you are experienced filmmakers, but we want to go through some of the basics, some of the core elements that make Red different. And just this is like kind of a light version of what we call exposure dynamics. And so, what is exposure? Being that light that, in terms of the quality of light and the light that's actually coming in into your sensor, determined by shutter speed and lens aperture. The strategy, record as much light as possible. So what we're finding is that people are generally underexposing for the most part, because if you're exposing to your monitor, you're tending to look for that best image on the monitor, and that can be problematic in many ways. So a lot of times you want to be pushing your exposure, and we're going to be promoting that pretty heavily. Control, right? So we all understand lens, T-stops, ND filters, and lighting. ISO is something we're going to touch on right now. Again, we get into a deeper dive, but ISO is not necessarily a reality in terms of exposing the actual image. It's affecting how you are looking at your exposure because it's just metadata that can be changed around in post. And that's where people come from, DSLR worlds and things like that, when they start pushing their ISO and realizing, what is the difference between that being baked in and how you can use it to your advantage, just to be able to see an image, or pushing it all the way and realize when you're not clipping, because basically you can kind of move it around. And our strategy is actually shooting below what that kind of magic 800 number is, down in the 500, 640 range. And shutter speed, right? So shutter speed typically used for creative control and motion blur. But we're going to mention a little bit more about shutter and how shutter is actually different on a Komodo versus other cameras, and how you could be using shutter to get better exposure by basically opening it up, and then the reality of what you're doing creatively. So jumping into Ivan's exposure strategy.
Yeah, feed the beast. So the idea with any Red camera, whether it's Komodo or DSMC3, the Raptor, the idea is to get as much light to the sensor as possible. This way, it helps to eliminate any potential of noise. It gives you the most flexibility in post while you're going through the color process. So in essence, you're controlling your exposure in post processing. With ISO and some other tools that you have available to you. So you have ISO control and you also have exposure control. But what this does, it just gets as much information to the sensor as possible. And like Bill was saying, a lot of guys that I see shoot this camera will shoot it so it looks really good on their monitor. But the problem is they're not taking into account any post-processing. And a lot of times when it looks really good on your monitor, it tends to be a little underexposed. And so you really need to pay attention to that. I've seen guys that have been shooting on this camera for years, and they're still underexposing this camera rather than getting as much light to the sensor so that they could go through in post and actually creatively kind of elongate their image and add more contrast, add more saturation, and it just gives you the most flexibility in post.
Yeah, diving in. We would always, I think back in earlier education days, it was always about like, what is the digital thick negative, right? So like when we were exposing film, you might take a meter reading, but you open it up a little bit more because you wanted all that exposure onto a film stock. And so that's how you push it. So this is an example, and I'm going to take it. This is an example that Ivan shot. And if you look at it as shot, you might look at it and think, this looks a little blown out, but, talk about it.
Yeah. So this was shot up in BC, up on top of a snowy mountain ridge. And again, the idea was to get as much light to the sensor as possible so that I could get as much information in the shadow details, in the shadows as I possibly could. So, so on the left, just looking at it straight out of the box, it doesn't look like a good image. It looks washed out. It looks flat. And a lot of times, you hear that a lot from people that aren't used to these cameras. When they first see the camera turned on, they're like, "Oh, it just looks so flat." Well, again, going back to post-processing, this really is a post-processing tool or camera. It's much like film, where you're push-pull processing in post. And so shooting at an 800 ISO with wider aperture. You can see when we adjusted in post, we took it down to ISO 250, and we were still able to maintain all the details in the shadow. So you can see her hair, you can see the hoodie that she's wearing under the fur collar jacket. Bill?
Yeah, you started cutting out a little bit.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah, it's really about, protecting those low light areas. And, I'm sure everyone's got their own strategy. I was doing a sunset. I really started pushing it to the point where you're not clipping. And we're going to show you those tools that, Red's got built in that shows you when you're actually clipping lights and when you're making that decision. And, as a sunset, you could see, by itself on the monitor, look horrible at people like looking over my shoulder, is this how it's going to look? I said, no, it's really not, but I'm going to see all that detail on the planes all the way out. And I didn't clip this on and went down. And once you, kind of put it through that process, it really looked beautiful. This is what we're talking about in shutter, right? And just again, the quick version of it. What's different about the Komodo is that we're looking at a total or global shutter versus a rolling shutter, right? And so what makes these cameras essentially special, because it's a hard thing to do and maintain latitude, is having essentially like a film frame exposed all at one time, as opposed to a rolling shutter where you're scanning lines up and down. And that's when we start seeing those effects of, the jello effect, where we're looking at like blades on a copter that, start to bend and things of that nature. So that's why when you start, looking at like Keaton's work and sticking a Komodo on a drone and moving really fast and not having those effects happen when you don't have, rolling versus a total or global shutter. Same thing here, where you kind of see the bends. This is playing. You can see the bends in the rotors. Oops, that was actually when it was playing. Yeah, so you see the bends in the rotors there versus the global up top. Same effect that you'll see a lot when you see half gunshots, half flash bulbs, because it can't process the information fast enough. And granted, we get into these bigger camera systems and a Raptor, it does it much better. But if you're coming out of DSLR worlds, that's when you kind of notice, when you have speeds that can actually record that way. And that's what makes this the shutter different on the Komodo particular cameras. But if we're talking about just using shutter as a tool for exposure, this is another example that Ivan shot, and the idea that, we can actually open our shutter to get more light. And so if our strategy is to always, feed that beast and get as much light as possible, you're going to be in situations, and this is actually a difficult situation that I'll let Ivan take over and talk about. But when you've got a lot of movement, we're talking about, well, we've got movement in front of the lens, and what kind of effect does that give versus even with wildlife? And maybe, you guys could jump in like Aaron, if you start, going for a faster shutter and getting that very staccato motion. But this is an example of just pulling more light into the lens when you need it, when you're in a situation when you're sitting and waiting and the sun's going down and I need to get more exposure. If you've got an interview and somebody's sitting there and you're in a situation, I don't have much light I'm working with, I can open my shutter up more and get more exposure. The camera that I'm on now, I open the shutter up, even though I'm moving back and forth, just so that I can get more depth in my stop, and you could see me better. So Ivan, talk about this.
Yeah, this was a situation where we were doing a documentary in Madagascar, and we had to remain really light and nimble. So we didn't have any kind of light kit with us. We were just dependent on the available light and natural light sources. And here we're following this group of young adults into this bar. And the only lighting available to us were these small fluorescent tubes, and then the reflection coming off of these small fluorescent tubes off of the corrugated tin you can see back there, and a lot of these green and blue tarps in the background. I was on a Zeiss Supreme lens, and I had to be opened all the way to T1.5. And I still wasn't getting quite what I needed as far as light. And so what I did is I took my shutter to a 360 shutter. So instead of, and I'm shooting 24 frames per second. So instead of shooting 1/48, I was shooting 1/24. So that gives you a 360 shutter, allows more light to hit the sensor, gives you the advantage of having less possibility for noise in the image. Now, the one effect is you have when you go to a wide open shutter like that is motion blur. And so you can see that the girl in red, there's a little bit of motion blur. The girl in red and the girl with the holding the beer above her head. So they were dancing. And so you can see that there is a little bit of motion blur with them. If you were to play this clip out, it's not distracting. Their movement is relatively quick, but my focus was the girl in the bottom in the left-hand corner, smoking the cigarette. And so, so I wasn't too worried about motion blur issues, but that is something you need to really pay attention to if you're going to use this trick. You really have to pay attention to the motion in the scene and allow yourself to compensate for that. You know, if you're shooting in low light wildlife, like a cheetah or something like that, or some sort of hunting behavior, predatory behavior, with that kill, you probably don't want to be at a 360 shutter because it's just going to be smeared and a lot of super blurry. So you might want to be at a standard shutter at that point. But it's a really good way in a tough situation where you don't have lighting available to you, have a lens that has a very fast, that's very fast, and then also take advantage of that shutter and open it to a 360. You don't necessarily have to go to 360. You can go from a 1/48 to like 1/30, and that will give you a tremendous amount of light versus just shooting your standard 180-degree shutter.
Yeah, and we should talk a little bit about, well, I'm going to show you, how you actually change that readout, but we talk about 360-degree shutters being the equivalent of 1/24. So if you're shooting 24 frames a second, you're 1/24, right? So a typical 180-degree shutter is like a film frame, and a film shutter, but it's a 180-degree circle. And that's why when you see the angles on the camera on the settings versus the time, and that's where that falls into play, and it just as a lighter version, that's why we actually see both of them. So if you have on these cameras set to degrees and 180 degrees, and you change your frame rate, it will stay at 180 degrees. If you have it set to 1/48 and you change your frame rate to 1/48, it's going to be 1/48, and you're going to be at 360 degrees. So you have to be paying attention to, why we have actually the differences and those readouts and what you're actually doing. So 360 is wide open, and 180 is normal. So it's kind of that half circle.
Yeah, and the opposite of this is like, especially for some of the wildlife shooters, I haven't seen it used too much. You see it done in narrative, but not too much in wildlife. But for the example of like, you have two male bears that are fighting over territory or whatever, and they're coming and they're getting into a super aggressive fight. If you narrow up that shutter, kind of like the opening scene from Saving Private Ryan, where you have a lot of that staccato and it's really, really sharp, it actually gives the viewer this visceral feeling, and it really attracts your viewer and pulls them into the scene, and it helps them feel the power of the scene that's happening. So these two bears, shooting these two bears at a narrower shutter, where you're going to have more staccato, it's going to be a little bit sharper. That will add an intensity to that moment, and it is a powerful tool, not only for exposure, but for creative shots as well. A lot of you probably already know this, but there's probably some of you that don't. And so, yeah, give it a try. Play with that shutter. 360 gives you a lot more motion blur, more of a dreamy kind of look, and a narrow shutter gives you more of this visceral, into the action. It pulls you into the action and really livens things up.
Yeah.
Hey,
Aaron,
Bill,
how are you using
can't
shutter?
probably dive into too much of this, but there's your image with the girl in the snow in the background, and we were talking about exposure. People have a lot of questions about exposure and how it's metadata versus not metadata and ISO settings. So, in the normal class, we would spend about 4 hours on this topic.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's hard to just breeze through things, but maybe just spend a couple more minutes on how you do this. And people are also asking about your comment about people looking over your shoulder and how you send an image to Video Village that looks right, and just maybe spend 2 minutes on that whole topic so we can tie it up.
Okay. Yeah. So for this, I'll cover the Video Village and sending that image out. You can actually have a LUT on your camera that you can load via an RDM file, and that's or RMD file, which is red metadata file. And that LUT can actually sit on the camera, and you can send that out via separate feed to Video Village so that you can see on your camera how you're used to shooting and exposing, but then you can send that separate feed out to Video Village with a LUT assigned to it. So it gives them a kind of a rough idea of what it's going to look like in post. And that's something that you would work on in pre-production, build out that LUT and all of your camera testing and have that ready to go once you're on set. ISO is metadata. So that means that it's not a mechanical function in the camera. So for those cameras that are where you're using ISO to control exposure, a lot of those are, that's a hard exposure tool where you're actually amplifying the signal, and that amplification of the signal becomes burned into the raw file, if you will. So with red cameras, that signal is never amplified. It just collects as much light to the sensor as possible. And what that does, it allows you in post to work with that metadata, that ISO metadata, to control exposure in post. It's one of the only cameras that I know of where ISO is metadata, and you have other cameras out there too that if you're shooting raw, you have access to this. I just can't.
The one example we give, because it's one of the test shots that we give people to go try, is right. You have the same, the same cameras. Even if you took the same camera, same stop, T4, set your ISO to 500, get a good exposure, that you're looking at, so the T-stop is actually affecting, you don't have any clipping going on because you've used your tools, take that shot, and then go to 12,800 and see it completely blown out on the monitor, but you notice that your raw tools, being your stoplights and things that were going to look like, they haven't changed. And then when you bring that to the post, it's going to look bright, but then you're going to slide that back to where 500 was, or you're going to take them both to 800, and it's going to look exactly the same because you haven't, essentially turned on the gain for the video. Aaron, you have any insights into that and how you're using shutter?
Yeah, just really quickly, what you guys are referencing, I call shoot to the right? It's feed the beast, let the maximum amount of light into the camera. I'm almost always using 180-degree shutter. And with wildlife, oftentimes I'm controlling the amount of light with my frame rate. So one of the features that I was actually really excited about for Komodo-X, and I was like fingers crossed, like sitting by my computer waiting for the announcement, I was hoping that the camera was going to have 4K 120, because 120 frames per second on fast moving animals and erratic subjects, it slows everything down, and it just brings the viewer into this like magical world of animals that you can't see with your naked eye. So we've got those high frame rates, and I use those a lot. I see some people that joined from Chile. I was just down in Chile. I filmed pumas down there, and actually had the opportunity to film, really epic puma hunt. And I filmed it at 120 frames per second. But there are scenarios that happen in the first thing in the morning and in the evening as the sun goes down, where you need to let in more light. So oftentimes to maintain the 180-degree shutter for wildlife, what I do is I just lower the frame rate. 60 frames per second, twice the amount of light hitting the sensor. And then I use are you guys going to talk about traffic lights?
Yeah.
I use the traffic lights, and that really, really simplifies exposing on the red, because I know it is a little bit of an unfamiliar concept that ISO is basically non-destructive to edit and post. So looking forward to seeing what you guys say about that.
Yeah.
So what it does is, what 800, people always think of 800 as like this baseline, right? Here's the maximum, latitude you're getting on both sides of it. But a lot of times we'll go to 640 or 500 because it's informing your decision to go, if I'm at 500, it's looking darker. That means I need to get more light in. And if I went back up to 800, I'm still pretty good, as opposed to trying to push it forward, at, 12, going up the range over 1,000 and seeing a brighter image on my screen. It wants you to add more light, find other ways to add more light. So even if I'm at 500, I go inside and I start opening up everything I can, I know I can still go up to 800, I can still go to 1,000. I've gotten as clean an image as I could by, adding more light that way.
Yeah, think of ISO as a lookup table. I mean, that's really all it is. It's a LUT that you're yeah, it's a preview. And like Bill was saying, you can't get yourself into trouble if you're playing with that ISO to think that you're affecting your exposure. And what'll happen is it'll actually, like Bill was saying, it'll influence your mechanical exposures. So you may close down or stop or stop up for light with your iris, just based off of what you're seeing on the monitor without looking at your metering tools, and that could cause you to clip the image. Clip meaning oversaturating your brights, your highlights. Yeah. So you have to be really careful of that and understand that what you're seeing on the onboard camera monitor, that will influence how you're exposing. So you really need to pay attention to your meters. Understand that ISO is a post exposure tool, and it's 100% metadata. And so you can control that throughout the entire pipeline.
Yeah, on the flip side, we've actually had a case where you could use it as a composition tool, because remember the woman down in Texas, she was trying to film bobcats under her porch.
Yeah.
And you may be getting as much light and you've done everything you can, but to be able to see them and follow them, you could crank up the ISO just so you could see it on your monitor, but it's not actually, making it that gritty, grainy look. Then you pull it back and you have to do whatever you can. But you could use it, as a framing technique, and then, it's low light, and then lights are going to come on kind of thing, and be able to see what you're actually looking at.
Yeah. So I think we were on the meters. Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is what your raw meter looks like. So if you look at this image on the bottom left-hand corner, you see the RGB stoplights are lit. So how you read this, so I kind of equate it to a football pitch or a soccer pitch. And so your midline is everything above your midline are your highlights. Everything below that midline are your shadows. And so if you have all of your lights kicked on, so all of your stoplights, so RGB, red, green, blue, if you have those on, it means you're clipping those highlights. You're overfilling the bucket of the pixel or the photo site. Yeah. And this is how it tells you. And so you can see the amount of the pixels in frame that have the potential of clipping, and that's what the bars are for. So you see the green bar is actually lit up much more than the red and blue. So you're going to lose a lot of detail and a lot of information in that green channel versus the red channel and the blue channel. And so you really, if you don't look at anything else, just look at this and you'll get a perfect image every time. If you don't clip and you limit the amount of underexposure. Underexposure you can fix in post with plugin tools like Neat Video. So if you don't have any choice and you have to be underexposed, it's a really low light environment, understand that you can actually correct that noise in post, but ideally you're not getting any noise in the first place. Whereas with the image on the left and the way that this is exposed right now, this is all information that you can't recover. The bucket of that photo site has been overfilled and you've lost all of that information. And that's what this meter is telling you. You also have a histogram, and the histogram represents the metadata. So if you were to change your ISO, for example, your raw meters, which are your stoplights, wouldn't be affected at all, but you will see that histogram move back and forth. Now, in the live class, we actually go pretty in depth into the histogram and why you shouldn't actually pay too much attention to it. But just keep your eye on that bottom left-hand corner. That's your raw exposure meter. That's the one indicator you want to look at. If you're clipping in the highlights, you can't get that information back. If you've got a little bit of noise in the shadows, you can always fix that. So just finding the balance, given whatever you're shooting, just find that balance for your exposure and just don't clip. And like Aaron was saying, expose to the right as much as you can.
Yeah, and I think what we mean by exposure on the right is people would look at that histogram and how it shifted, and we use it as a kind of sort of a quick reference tool of where you may
Right.
be sitting, with the image. And so people understand too that this is the menu for Komodo. And we'll see a Komodo-X and how it maybe becomes a little bit different in what you're looking at. But the ecosystem and how Red's going from DSMC2 have the same kind of tools involved. So when we talk about stoplights, they're on either side versus kind of that pitch that we've got working here, but there are still like they're up and down stoplights versus what we see now across. But it's the same concept. And that histogram is considered like downstream RGB versus stoplights, and what we look when we'll look at false color mode, that being the raw, and what you're actually seeing in the raw. So like we talked about not clipping, if you pushed forward to 12,800 and your stoplights weren't peaked before, but your image is really bright, those stoplights still will not move. They won't peak because you haven't actually changed exposure at all physically. Anything else? And then this is just a close-up of what Ivan was talking about, that you're seeing with the indicators and how much the quantity of pixels below and above that line are. So we should jump to our actual camera body here, right? And so so you know that I'm going to do an overhead here. I'm going to have an outboard feed coming from here. We'll see the difference in how you can actually change the look of that now. And we're going to kind of talk through some of these overhead menus in here and what they mean. I'm not going to go too far in depth with a lot of the meanings of what's on here, so much as you can, hit the top level and get to the menus, differently, especially like your media, hitting top there, going to media instead of navigating through the actual menus themselves. We'll notice the difference in here in that we're using different media being, instead of the CFast cards, the CF Express cards, right? That are reading there, and what you have left, and being Wi-Fi on, et cetera, across the top. And then just like we were looking at the other slide, we have frames per second. We have that little pitch here, our information that you tap on to get your histogram or your shooting information, your audio meters, and being able to change internal and external there, record, and then your basic functions down there that we're going through. I should also mention, just so that people are aware, because I know we were going to take this and I feel like we're already kind of looking at time, in terms of the difference between these. If we can, see some of this, is that on Komodo, if you're familiar with Komodo, we have BP batteries on the back, or you're adding a V-Lock battery pack, and our connections are at the bottom there, versus X, right, that actually has the built-in battery pack here, right? So you have a V-mount there, and it's already built in there. And then we have our outputs and our antenna on the back part instead of on the side. We've got a record button there like it was, and then a record button now in the front that is not on the regular Komodo. And those buttons are now going to be user assignable. So we're going to be able to see how you can actually do a half press and assign different functions to those as well. Audio is now a LEMO connection. So these LEMO connectors that go to a mini plug are actually very handy. So you're getting cleaner audio coming in and out, and then all your ports, are to the side instead of on the bottom there, which makes it now nice and built in. Right, so that's the difference there. Physically,
that's the same port that the Raptor has, right? That's the 9-pin LEMO.
Yes.
I believe so.
Yeah, so you can.
Yeah, it's the same plug.
Yeah, so there's a cable that you can get that's actually it's a 9-pin LEMO to dual XLR.
Yeah, you can get that too, right? I had a wireless, so I was using this one, but
yeah.
Into that. I should also say this is actually hooked up. This also has a USB-C connector instead of that adapter that we needed. That I know we were talking about yesterday, Christine, that you need to actually, attach it to the top to have that USB-C output. USB-C is built in. On this, I actually have it set up with a USB-C to Ethernet connection. So I'm writing right into the Ethernet versus even using wireless. I've also was able to plug in my phone with the Red Control app directly to the USB-C and see it, without any lag on it, and have complete control that way.
Nice.
So getting into try to get this back into position. All right, giving a rundown here and what's a little bit different and hitting the tools, right? We're going to see we have LCD, it's going to be magnify versus our SDI out. It's interesting on here now, these are all the tools that we were going to talk about, is that this says onboard LCD guides and onboard LCD tools, and it's now onboard instead of just LCD. And we're going to see why, because you actually have two different options for LCDs when we get into monitoring, because you can use the Raptor monitor, right? That is that large monitor that's a USB-C connection. You can mount it to the top here. So you can actually, have to choose between seeing the LCD built in and the LCD that's connected because it's not an SDI out. So we'll see some of the differences in there. These are our focus tools that we spend a lot of time on, being edge. That's going to give you that output there, right? So it's changing what that is. I think it's really good for landscapes. I found it really helpful landscape when you can't really see exactly like the scale of a mountain and distances, and be able to get something sharp and push it back. Peaking, that I think a lot of people are used to, having that colored peaking look there, versus focus, which is just that that sort of line. And this is the kind of thing that I think Ivan and I use a lot, that you can kind of tell. This is another one of those things where if you have this on, and in fact, I had it on my camera here, and I was trying to test my image, going, why is this a little crazy looking? It was because focus tool was on, and essentially it's sort of highlighting, the gain in those edges in that way. Exposure, right? That's our exposure tool output. So when we're talking about exposure, as opposed to this is our raw exposure. So purples are where are hitting that kind of underexposed threshold, and reds are where you might be approaching peaking or peaking. So in this case, this is set up so it's built. I've got light bulbs that are turned on that probably hitting that peaking level or getting close to peaking, and then grays and greens being right kind of in that sweet spot. Because if I go back
quick note on people's configurations, they can change their view to just have the speaker view, so that your little picture of the camera will be bigger.
Right. I think we take it for granted that people know how to use Zoom so much in these cases, but when we get in these large groups, right? Yeah, we've got to make sure you pin that window so that it makes it larger. So that's the focus tool. Exposure, again, we're going to be able to have control over actually being able to use that in different ways, but that's the kind of the preferred way of checking your exposure. And we'd see in here, right, on those little stoplights, right where I showed you, right, when we have exposure turned on, if I go back to, pressing there, turn exposure, go back, right, I have a little peaking going on, I have a little clipping going on, that red and green, but I also have that drop off where those areas of purple were, right, in there, that are showing up, kind of a small amount of pixels in there. But again, in this situation, those might be clipping, but they're light bulbs. You're not seeing any detail in there. So this might be a situation where you're going to push the exposure as much as you can out of it to gain light in those lower areas, and not really worry about those pinpoint, those little red lights or that light bulb in the background, because it's not really, it's not like clouds where, you clip clouds and your eyes can't, may fill in that gap, right? In there, right? And here, when I hit on tools, right, it's actually going to call up. I think if you're on a previous, even a firmware on Komodo, that was just, exposure, and then there was video mode, and now they've kind of hidden it in here. So you could turn on false color. You can go into have exposure being the default. Video is now going to give you that video signal, kind of like a video truck signal going in and out, and geoscope is now built in. Geoscope is essentially a contrast tool that is great for, and we're not going to spend too much time in it with it here. It will make it gray, and then you can choose your exposure numbers, especially good for green screen. So I can pick 8 and 9 and say, that's the exposure level I need that background to be, and then start lighting on those other points. So you have your full range of exposure, and it will just give you all the colors in there. And that's a very typical thing on that was on DSMC3 that is now built into Komodo. And then our log view, seeing log view and zebras in and out, right? Jumping down into here, right? Frame rates on Komodo, regular Komodo cap out at 40, right? We can now go up to 80, right? I also love that you can go all the way to the end and see the maximum frame rates. So right in here on Aaron's wish list, 120 frames per second at 4K, right? So we actually get a sense of that. So that's a really nice, that was on Raptor, and now, you know, we're able to see it here. Also in here, we had somebody that, you know, every time they wanted to type in, and this is now available on Raptor, they wanted to have a specific frame rate being 32 frames a second. You can go in and edit and choose, you know, oh, this is the kind of frame rate that I want to use more often than what is the built-in presets. And so I can add 32 frames a second and I don't have to do it every time. It's now going to appear in my list there, right? So that's a handy thing as well. So that's new. ISO, we talked about ISO and how that's affecting exposure. You're seeing a sort of shift in here. Let me take these tools off real quick so we can see the image there, right? And if I see, you know, my stoplights and things there, and I take ISO, right, and I crank it up to there, right, that hasn't changed. You know, this might have changed, but my ISO being pushed up isn't clipping or having any effect on the lower areas any more than it did before. It just looks a lot different, right? There, and I had this down to 500. I see the difference there. All right. Iris,
Hey,
so iris control.
Bill, real quick.
Yeah.
Hey guys, for those of you that are just looking at thumbnails, if you want a full screen Bill, if you just hover your mouse over his over the camera screen, you can just click the 3 dots, and it'll ask you to, if you want to pin. If you pin it, then you'll get a full screenshot of his screen.
I think actually the controls on my end, so I just made it a speaker view, so whoever's talking is going to be full screen. Hopefully that's
Perfect.
working for people.
Thanks, Brian.
Okay, good. So it's automatic. All right. In here, f-stops, you can actually edit that too. So we can change, you know, what we're actually seeing. We can also look at different increments. Get this back, right? So I can edit that list. Now here's, this was really cool. This was one of these things that I think we have talked to Red about. It's not on the regular Komodo, the newest firmware yet. But if I go into here, right, I can edit this list, but I can also press and hold and change that to time. So I don't have to go into my system status settings and change it from time to angle, right? And like I said, if I change that now, if I change my speed to, you know, 48 up here, right, that stays at 148, which means that's a 360-degree shutter, right? If I go back to 24, I'm gonna have to motor along here, I think a little bit more, but I change this now, press and hold, back to angle, right? And I change that to 48, it stays at 180 degrees. So it's staying the right fraction of time by staying on angle. And that's, I found that to be a really fun, this is one of these things where I just tried it when I got this to see if they had enabled it. It's the same thing with Kelvin, right? I can edit that list, but I can also go in and press and hold that in here and change it to presets. So now I see a list of presets being tungsten, incandescent, fluorescent lighting, because I had this set originally to like 4,600. So that's nice without having to get in and actually change the settings and what the readout actually works in system status. The other thing we talked about ISO, white balance, whereas you always want to maintain the best white balance and get the best images possible. White balance is also metadata. So unlike, you know, other systems where it's essentially kind of burnt in, and if you're shooting ProRes, which actually this is set up for right now for a specific reason, you know, you would have that basically you could change it up to a point without, you know, damaging the image. But if you had to run in and run out in a documentary and hadn't changed anything, it's as simple as just changing that setting back in either Red Cinex or any program that you're working with. And it will switch it back to where it needs to be. You know, sometimes I've had people do an auto white balance by mistake and then realize to come in and it's all very magenta and, you know, just hit default and it would set it back.
Hey, Bill, one real quick thing. So
Yeah.
for shutter, as Bill showed on the camera, you have the option of doing fraction or degrees. If you're in a situation, and this question came up in the comments, if you're in a situation where you're actually having flicker from different sources of lights,
Oh yeah.
and there's nothing you can do to change, you're not able to swap out bulbs or whatever. Really, your only option is to really sync your shutter to that light. And so the better way to do it is to be in fractions rather than degrees, because fractions will give you more options to help you correct that flicker. If you still have a little bit of flicker in there and you just can't get around it, then there's a plugin called, I think it comes with After Effects, and it's called Deep Flicker. And that'll get rid of all the flicker. But between those two, degrees or fraction, I would recommend being on fraction to help you negate flicker.
Yeah. I think as we thought so, Ivan, we're kind of pushed in time. So we want to sort of do a skim overview of, I think, what the top level menus, are, but kind of hit the important ones and taking a look at them. Image and LUTs is, adding, we're not going to get into LUTs, in terms of how much we can change it and add, different LUTs in different settings. A lot of this can be changed in post settings as well, that maybe Christine's going to show in Premiere, at least that panel, right? As far as what we can change there. Project settings is really the important one, right? So up top, what format we're actually looking at, 6K 17:9 is now considered full frame versus 16:9, and then having the option to shoot, widescreen and anamorphic, etc. Right? Recording frame rates, we saw at the top level. Time base is something we get into normally, 24 versus 23:9:8. In this case, file format will always present to you that you should shoot R3D and not necessarily ProRes. We know when there's times to shoot ProRes. I'm in ProRes now because when we show you the trick with Frame.io, ProRes proxies are going to be the fastest way for you to see it. Whereas on Raptor, you can shoot both R3D and then ProRes proxies. But if I did it now, I would have to reboot and go through that process. But it also gives you in here, we're not going to talk too much about quality and compression right now. You can choose MQ is basically your medium quality, where you typically shoot everything. You can go down to ELQ. It's been documented by our friends at Red, particularly Dan, who said ELQ at 6K is going to be better than 4K at HQ. So it's like shoot as much resolution and shoot the full sensor as possible, as opposed to compression. These are your compression settings. Compression is something we also get into much more in depth in the longer classes. Here we'll pick our different flavors. We'll pick whether or not we're going to go into shoot an actual ProRes flat image. So it's like shooting, any other flat image in a lot of different cameras, where you can shoot like a vlog or, those kinds of things, versus that like an image LUT or like at Rec 709. So you're actually burning that in. Pre-record is something we get into big. What's nice about this camera, I'm sure, Aaron, you're excited about this, is that pre-record numbers have gone way, way up on Komodo-X, whereas on Komodo, I think they're 2.6 seconds, something like that, unless you start dropping in resolution. Right now, I think because I'm in ProRes, it's giving me more, but I think it's hovering around 20 seconds. Do you remember, Aaron?
On this camera?
On the X. Yeah, if you're at full, because I'm at 6K, but I'm at ProRes, so I think I'm getting a little bit more.
It goes down with the frame rate. And so I know there's a lot of talk online right now about, a push to get Red to give us more pre-record time, because it can be a game changer. I was just at Alaska, and the fish are jumping, and it's really hard to predict. And, you don't want to leave, the camera recording for 30 seconds because the files are big. So, but you will see it drop with the frame rate.
Yeah, but pre-record is amazing. So pre-record real lightly, right? And Ivan has a good story on this. It's basically recording what's already happened and putting it into a buffer, right? So that everything that I'm doing now, right? If I hit the button and hit record, you will have already seen that. So if I'm concentrating on a flower and a hummingbird flies in, I hit record, I'm now getting the hummingbird flying in. I did this pretty well with lightning. You see lightning, you're just waiting for it. You hit record, And depending on how many seconds you have available to you, then you have that much more pre-record time. So DSMC2, you had 30 seconds. You could, I remember Russell talking about, he was at a tree, he walked away back to his truck and still ran back and got the shot because he hit record and it had already recorded the action. So it's a pretty amazing thing. If those of you familiar with audio, it's been available in audio for a while, but on a camera, it's a pretty cool tool to have.
Yeah, it gives you time to have a bathroom break if needed.
Yeah. Motion and time lapse. So it's just straight motion, or we go into time lapse mode. It gives you a different readout. So I have more control over how many frames a second I'm actually going to be shooting. Right.
Bill, I don't see your menu anymore.
Oh, sorry. I do that a lot. So if I go down into here, we have motion and time lapse. I can set the time lapse, and then it gives me control over how many frames, and how many seconds I'm actually able to control versus just sliding it back to, 1 or 2 frames a second. Right. And that's all in pre-record there. Right. Audio and time code. Right. Just giving you a lot of your different options for internal, external sources now. Monitoring. This is a little different in that now we're seeing onboard LCD, top LCD. So onboard is the one built into the top, and then top LCD would be the other monitor that I would have hooked up to my pins, essentially like the Raptor monitor. So you can get that other monitor that is going to mount right to the top and just use the USB-C cables, right? And then going into live stream, SDI out, whether or not I'm going to turn on all these things that we saw, all the tools that we had available to us, setting different guides. I can actually adjust what kind of guide I'm seeing. So I could be shooting full frame, but framing for widescreen. Those kinds of things. Again, items that I think we get into much more in depth. Media, secure format media, ejecting media. One of those cool push button options now is if you have a Raptor and you press and hold the media button, it will now eject. So you don't have to go into the menu to do it. User settings, setting up autofocus, right? So enabling it so that I have control over the top level screen, so I could actually move around where my focus mark is. We're going to get to communication last. System settings, indicators, license lens is actually, this one's pretty cool. If you have a certain kind of lens, like an RF lens. So like I have the RF 70 to 200. The other guys I work with have this 24 to 70. You can actually use the menu and change a control ring on the lens to do different functions. So like on the 70 to 200, it's the focus one. They have a focus ring on the back, which is nice. You're not reaching up to the front, but there's also a control ring that will control aperture or ISO or any other, there's one other thing. One of the other shutter, you can control shutter by moving the dial, so it actually clicks on you. So that's a cool feature too.
We got to watch our time, Bill.
That, Aaron? What?
We got to watch our time.
Yeah, we're going to move on now. Power sensors, system status, right? This is all the display modes that we were talking about. And then system status, and here just all your information. So these are things that everybody can go through: indicators, sensor power, lens, licensing, date and time, just your basic settings. What we really want to be able to jump to is communication, right? So communication enables you to use the Red Control app for one, right? So this is just telling you what your camera and camera serial number is, right? I have connections that I'm hooking up. So right now I'm USB-C. Right, and I think this had popped out. So if I take this out, look it back in, you're going to see it connect, hopefully. So you'll see everything suddenly, it should populate with, the gateway numbers, there it goes. So it essentially popped up automatically your Ethernet connection. Or we go into Wi-Fi. So if I set Wi-Fi now to infrastructure, right, that means I'm now connected into like my house Wi-Fi or whatever, whatever place you're in, or if you have essentially a separate router that you've hooked up out on a set, right? Or I'm going to choose ad hoc, right? Ad hoc is now going to make the camera itself be a Wi-Fi center. So you would then take your phone, go into settings, choose the camera name, use the serial number to the camera, whatever you've renamed it as your password, and it will connect to your camera, open Red Control app, and then be able to actually control and see the live output from the camera itself. What we want to get into now, right, is getting back into these, going into clients and services, not clients and services, cloud upload, right? Clients would be, you know, what we're going to do. We're going to go to Frame.io here, right? I've got this enabled already. And then I can choose Frame.io or S3, which is another, I think it's an Amazon storage. I don't know if I remember correctly. I haven't used it yet. Upload
right.
file types. Is that what it is? S3?
Yes, it's Amazon World Services. Yeah, it's for
Yeah.
uploading to AWS.
Yeah, so I'm turning on, I'm not doing R3Ds. If we've taken R3Ds, I actually did it pretty fast, right to my computer, but you don't see them. So this is going to give us, right now it's grayed out because I'm only in ProRes for that reason. But I can choose, you know, doing both, doing one, adding the CDL, right? So I've got it set to move. So those are the ones that are going to upload, right? It's saying that I'm synced now, but I'm going to actually take this, and we were already done doing this. So I'm going to disconnect, right? So that we do this again. Correct?
Sure.
Christine?
Yeah,
All
I'll
right,
go
yeah.
ahead and take it away. I've got these bigger on my
Yes.
slides too. So.
Yes. Yeah. So you want to
Okay,
put that. So what I'm doing is I'm disconnecting from what we did yesterday to Christine's system in LA, right? Being in her Frame.io account. And now we're going to reconnect to it and show you how to get those files in. And then Christine's going to take over and take those files into post.
Yeah. Okay. So should I go ahead and share my screen and get going?
Yeah.
Okay. Hey, everybody. You should be able to see my screen now. Yes?
Yes.
Yeah, we got it.
Okay.
Got it.
There we go. All right, I'm going to blow through some of the slides pretty quickly, but don't worry, I will stop and pause and point out the stuff that's really critical for you to get. And you'll see exactly what Bill just did, but close up. So the most important thing to know if you're going to use the Frame.io camera upload is you're going into the camera menu and starting with communication. So I actually built this based on what I've been shooting my current documentary on are the Raptors, but most of the menu settings are really similar. It's super user-friendly. This isn't, you know, I'm not the cinematographer, but I found it pretty easy to go grab these and find where these things were. But here you go. So go into the communication menu, and then this is where you're going to find cloud upload, you know, and connections. So we're going to start with the cloud upload, and this is what you're going to be looking for: communication, cloud upload, enable. And that's what Bill just showed you. This is critical. So this is one of the things you must do if you want this to work. Go into the menu, communication. If you follow from left to right, cloud upload, and slide that enable button to green for go. Make sure your red camera has the cloud upload set to enable. And then the next thing to know is when you're inside that cloud upload enable, you have to also do this inside of your Frame.io project, which Bill and I will walk you through live. So I just kind of wanted to show you real quick. These are very similar to each other, but both must be enabled. When you log into Frame.io, you're going to go into your project settings, and I'll walk you through it. But that C2C connections, toggle it to the right so it's green, just like inside your red menu. So both of those are enabled, and this is what allows us to work. So if you walk away with nothing else, know that these two buttons must be green. Camera to cloud connection on Frame.io and in the camera. And then the next thing you want to do is what Bill showed you, is go into the service menu. So communication menu, cloud upload, service, and then choose Frame.io. And yes, that S3 is if you were automatically sending to AWS, but we're doing Frame.io. So there we go, we chose Frame.io. Back to the communication menu, I next go to connections. Now, what order you do this in is up to you. This is just my process. So in communications, you have connections. Now, depending on which camera you're using, you may have Gig E. My favorite way to do this in terms of what I practiced was using the USB port. And so I have a little adapter that goes USB to Ethernet. And that is a very handy device to have. So you may, depending on which camera you're using, need, if you're on the regular Komodo, you know, the Komodo camera requires this Komodo link. And I think it's worth it because the speeds for upload are really great. And you guys will have to correct me, but I think that's about what, $395 or something for the Komodo Link. But what you see on the far right, that white adapter, is that USB to Ethernet adapter. And the real cool thing about utilizing this is that you can remotely control the camera using Ethernet connected devices over long distances. I know some of the cinematographers use this for remotely controlling multiple cameras. And I think, Aaron, you were mentioning you use this to, you use this feature to connect your phone to sometimes control via the Red Control app. Is that correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And you don't need the link adapter on the Komodo-X, which is amazing.
Super helpful.
Yeah, I have my phone connected. Can you guys see this?
Yeah.
To use as a monitor. And you can do that two ways. Essentially, you go into the menu and you set the communication settings so that the Komodo-X will create a Wi-Fi signal. You connect on your phone and then open up the Red Control app, and it automatically will find the camera, and then you can see your image in real time. You can control all of the camera settings. So that makes for like a super efficient, super lightweight, super easy to set up rig, which is great for me. You know, I'm traveling internationally, things happen quick. I can set that up and grab some B-roll shots.
Aaron, show
also,
your rig one more time, because I didn't have the gallery view up for people to see.
Yeah.
That's super cool.
So this is all wireless. You don't need a cord. But one of the things I also love is if you want to connect for a little bit more stable connection, you can use the USB-C to Lightning cord that came with your iPhone. You don't need a special cord, and you just connect the USB-C into the back of the camera, the Lightning to the camera, and just go right into the app, and it recognizes the camera automatically, and you're shooting right away. It's amazing.
And
how's the video feed, Aaron? Is it lag? Does it lag at all compared to what
Yeah.
it did with the X
With
or the original Komodo?
No, it's much better. And I think it's because of the antenna has been redesigned on the back. You'll notice that it's longer. You got to be careful when you're traveling.
Yeah.
I pull mine off and you don't want to lose it, which has already happened to me once. But as long as you have that antenna on, you can get it's usable as long as you're not doing a lot of panning. You know, if you're filming airplanes, you probably want to just put the wire on. But what it gives you the ability not to be constrained to proximity. Well, there is a distance. I haven't tried to find the long end of what it'll do, but essentially, if you have somebody helping out with a shoot, they can monitor the camera from the iPhone. You don't have to be tethered with a wire.
Nice.
That is so nice. And that the Komodo-X doesn't need to have this link adapter, which is fantastic to know.
And it's not just iPhone specific, right? We could use any
Android. Any smartphone, right?
I haven't tried Android, so I don't know.
And with the Raptor, we
look that
didn't
up.
need the Raptor didn't need any kind of adapter either. We plugged right in, so that was pretty cool. So whichever of these cameras you know the audience is using, you have what you need to be able to accomplish this. I'm going to jump back to the connections menu. So communication, connections, and then in this case, you know, my favorite way to do this, just based on what I was experiencing, was that, of course, I had faster transfer speeds with the USB-C than with the Wi-Fi. So you choose how you want to connect to the internet, and don't get worried when you see this next slide. It's really user-friendly once I'm in there. This is just to point out that once you get inside communication connections and you choose USB-C, this is where you can go to your IP assignment. Ideally, if you've set this up, you can choose automatic and it scans for the network. But if you have any issue, you absolutely can manually enter an IP address if you need to under the configure IP, and that'll let you type in whatever you need to type in if you're having any concern about getting your connection. You also connect through Wi-Fi. And as expected, you know, the speeds are not as good. So we'll have that discussion as well about whether you're going to upload your R3Ds or just proxies, just ProRes. Ad hoc is what Bill was showing. And that's basically, you're using it as a Wi-Fi hotspot. You're basically using ad hoc to configure the camera as its Wi-Fi hotspot. So under the Wi-Fi menu in communications connections, You're choosing mode, it'll automatically say disabled. So this was a little bit confusing to me at first. All of you who are listening to this probably use this camera enough to know. After I figured it out once, I was good to go. Like, it's like, oh, okay, it's under mode. And then under mode, switch disabled to ad hoc. And then under ad hoc, so ad hoc you see is grayed out in the upper image. It doesn't, and until you enable ad hoc, it doesn't give you the ability to make changes in that submenu. So once that highlights, you're able to get into ad hoc. And this is where you enter the password for the internet, you know, for the Wi-Fi network you're using. And this is also where I was able to swap between the 2 gigahertz band and the 5 gigahertz band. And it's really straightforward once you get in there. So then moving on, once you're in here under infrastructure, this is where you can configure the camera to connect to an existing Wi-Fi network. And Bill mentioned this as well. So rather than using the camera as a Wi-Fi hotspot, this is you have an existing Wi-Fi network already, you choose infrastructure. And then once again, as soon as I knew that was what it was called, I had no problem finding my way back there. So SSID it's empty when you first see it. That's that middle image. So what happens is when you go to network and you select the network you want, then that upper right image, then on the camera menu, it populates and shows you what network you're connected to. In this case, it says Red 5. And then it also will show you that the status is connected. So I made a little note here that after the network is selected, then the SSID displays the Wi-Fi network name and you know you are good to go. So you can also use the networks menu to select a particular available network if there's many available. And you can also use it to scan for available networks in general. So then moving forward through the communication menu to cloud upload. Okay, so this is critical for Frame.io, and you are going to select upload file types. Now on the Raptor, you can see I chose all 4. And I was basically just kind of doing a test and seeing how long it took to upload R3Ds, and of course, the ProRes uploaded much more rapidly. I am a really big fan of asking my cinematographers to give me their LUTs, and I utilize them in post. And it's, you know, I'll get into that a little bit later, but I always want that file. I'm to understand that on the Komodo-X, you must choose either R3D or movie. On the Raptor, I was able to send both simultaneously. So there's a little asterisk next to select file types for upload because we want to discuss this a little bit more with the team in a minute here. The R3Ds and the proxy files. So here's the deal, that Komodo, it can't, as far as I know, you guys correct me if I'm wrong, it doesn't do both at the same time. I was only able to get to one or the other. So I can just say right now, unless you have 2 gigabytes per second, I don't recommend you're sending up the R3Ds. I mean, it takes a really long time through the Ethernet connection to upload those R3Ds on Wi-Fi. As soon as I was able to connect to the USB-C to Ethernet, I was able to get those R3Ds across fairly quickly, actually, but it just really depends on your network. And I started fantasizing, you know, that I was going to get myself a little backpack with a Starlink, and I'm going to wear Dishy McFace's like hat on set and have my own internet at high speeds. But for the time being, you know, using the Ethernet's the way to go, and it's also for me the way to go to send the proxies, send the ProRes is going to be a lot faster. So if you are on a slower network, I would recommend that. And we can discuss that with the group as well. Back in communication connections, cloud upload. This is what you saw Bill do. And just to back up a little bit here, this is under the Frame.io menu that's under cloud upload. And this must also say connect. Okay, so you're gonna select Frame.io, choose connect. Now, once you choose connect, it gives you this pairing code, right? So you can use this 6-digit code inside of the Frame.io via the web to type this code in, and what'll happen is it will say connect, okay. And then it automatically gives you the option to disconnect, which you watched Bill do so that we could do this in person and you guys will be able to see us go through this. So I'm going to go ahead and flip over to Frame, right? And let's take a look at Frame.io. You guys all seeing it? We good? Okay, cool. So in Frame.io, the first thing I want to mention is that this is free if you have an Adobe Creative Cloud subscription. So you are able to access this without paying that way. Otherwise, you do have to log in and create an account. I simply use my Adobe Creative Cloud ID. When I type in my Adobe ID, I get Frame.io. So, you know, this is definitely something you're going to have to add into your software toolkit if it's what you want to do. And I'm going to walk you through just the basics. So the first thing to do is you'll notice that I do have some stuff already going on in here. And let's see, there we go. I'm wondering if I have to log back in. What's going on? Okay, hold on. Sorry, guys. I'm clicking around and it's not responding to me, so.
Click the little arrow drop down maybe on the second file.
I'm trying to see if it's not giving me my, Let me see what's going on.
So on that file, there's a little arrow.
Yeah, what I'm looking for is my add new project button, which
Okay.
is missing for some reason. Huh. Well, that's very strange. Of course, when I tested this all out, everything went very well. So.
Yeah, this is the transfer app. You might just need to restart that.
Yeah, let me go ahead and see if I had it set up. Let me quit the transfer app. Right? Let's see if I can go ahead and log back in. Can you guys actually you guys want to turn screen sharing off, and Bill, do you want to share for a minute while I get this back up? There we go. Sorry, that was quick. I relaunched it. All right, there we go. All right, so the file transfer app was just sending me for a loop. Anyway, so when you log into Frame.io, if you notice, I'm just in Chrome. I just typed, login Frame.io, and it takes me here, and I log in as Steele Pictures. So it sees that this is my account, and under my account, I can add a project. So when I click the Add Project menu, this is where you get the new project dialog box that you can go ahead and name. So I'll type KOMODO-X, and I don't usually allow anyone to view the project publicly, but it is only anyone on your team. So you control this and can come back to this dialog box at any point in time. This is the button that you need to turn on, C2C connections. So if you walk away from here with nothing else, it's to know both in camera and in Frame.io, you have to enable this button, and then your files will transfer. You can go ahead and allow people to download the files. This is almost always green for me because the team members I share this with tend to be editors and assistant editors, and I want them to have access to the footage. But you also can control this at any point in time and allow comments and new media uploads. So I'm going to go ahead and create the project, and it'll say it's empty in here. You can drop files and folders to begin, but the first thing I'm going to do is click upload files. Once I do that, I can access, I've got an SSD loaded. I can access my recent shoot with all my red files here, right? So that's one way to go. Another thing that you can do is you can go ahead and sync. You can choose to go ahead and sync to someone else's camera and do a live camera to cloud. That would be up here in this menu list, C2C connections. So I have the option to ingest media that already I have on a hard drive, or I can connect directly to the camera by adding a new device. So I'll click add new device. The device that is ready to connect is going to be Bill's all the way in Northern Indiana, and I'm connecting from Los Angeles. So we're going to go ahead and enter the pairing code that Bill gives me. And so
you see that I pressed hit OK to connect, and it's 068
068 282. Thanks, Bill. All All right. Okay. So then I have to authorize him to have access to this project as he is authorizing me to have access to his camera. So there
And
we
now
go.
you see
And-
down here. Yeah, on my camera now it says creator Christine Steele
Nice.
connected.
Cool.
And now if I come back, that's finished, right? I'm going to go ahead and record a clip. Right? So I'm recording, come out here real quick. Over here. Turning off.
That was a nice pose, Bill. Good job.
Yeah, thanks.
Okay.
So you know it's live.
Are you still recording?
No,
Is it
I
good?
just did it real quick. You could hit finish.
Great. All right. So on my screen, it says success, device is connected. The recorded footage will be uploaded to a generated folder structure. You can move and organize those files once they're in. You just have to make sure that the upload destination you first choose, know that they're stuck with that project. So I'm going to click finish. And I have some options. You see that Bill's Komodo is online. I have some options under the 3 dots. I could rename this and call it Bill's camera if I want to. And I do want to point out that this does take a moment. It's not like this is instant, but it should be fairly quick.
And so, Christine, it's important if I'm not mistaken. I mean, R3Ds take a long time because of the file size, but also if you were shooting ProRes Quad 4, that would take an extraordinary long time because that's actually larger than an R3D file.
Exactly.
Right? So you want to make sure that whatever proxy you're shooting is a lower quality and it's for offline editing, right?
Exactly. So here's something that's really important. Exactly what Ivan was saying is that I did test with my cinematographer, Beth. Okay, what would it be like if we took the 4K ProRes as our proxies? And for us on location, it was way too long. In the end, the discussion that we had, me as one of the director producers and the cinematographer was to say, well, what do you recommend that I do? I really want to use these proxies immediately and get people editing. And ultimately what she advised me was, okay, let's do the test. It just took way too long. And then it became down to a choice of 2K ProRes proxies or 1080. We ended up going with the 1080 with the understanding, I supervise a lot of documentary series for PBS. In the end, I'm delivering 1080, but I'm able to use those 1080 so quickly. It was able to transfer so quickly. And then the R3Ds are still on my SSD drive, and the assistant editor can at any moment actually strike a transcode to whatever I want. If I want 4K at that point, it just turned out to be the better workflow for us so that on location, it was so light and easy to transfer the ProRes proxies and immediately everyone could see and play them. And I also requested she give me a LUT for every interviewee, as well as 2 different LUTs that she created that we liked, but my co-director and co-producer and I were not in agreement what we wanted to use. And I do use this immediately inside Premiere to start, you'll see that in a minute, to start actually communicating with people about the look that we want to go with. And let me go ahead and check and see if
you go to media, it should be there. So and the last thing, if you were
here.
watching me, I recorded a clip and you could see the time remaining and the speed right down on the screen there. So it had gone through.
Nice, I see it. So I see it here on my screen. You see under this Komodo-X project, cloud devices, I double click and it is a folder structure I cannot control. I can move these later, but initially this is done automatically. So I'm not a big fan of clicking into a million folders, but that's what you have to do to begin with before you organize it. So there are the 3 items I was sent. And inside of this, you'll see there'll be instantly a preview on the ProRes file. So I can see that this was shot today at 11:25 a.m. and our time anyway, my time. And then there is Bill's hand. The R3Ds, this is really important to note. The R3Ds will not have the preview. You cannot scrub through them. That's a Frame.io thing. It's not possible for you to do that. So don't think your image isn't there. It's there, but it does need to be downloaded and viewed in your editing app, whether you're using DaVinci or Premiere or whatever. You actually are not going to be able to scrub through anything but your ProRes. And then did you send, yep, you sent me the CDL and the RTN. Yep. Is the RTN's just a thumbnail?
It's a thumbnail, yeah.
It's a thumbnail. Now I have, I do want to point this out that I do have the option to individually click on the clips with the 3 dots here, and I could choose to download this particular clip. That is going to eliminate the file structure that I'm used to and want. Plus, I don't want to select every single clip one at a time and choose download. That would be madness for me. So I'm coming back up a level. If you see up here, and coming back up a level, and then I have the option for that package of 3 to simply download that entire folder of the 3 items that come with it. Or I could go back up another level to the dated folder, right? And it's up to me how I want to work this. I could go to the dated folder and download all of that was contained within there. Just for time's sake, I'm going to go in and select a single clip, but I wouldn't normally do this. I'm going to select the 3 dots and choose download as. Now, this is really critical information from my perspective as a post supervisor, as an editor. You want to choose ProRes or original. Do not choose anything that says proxy beneath this line, not only because MP4s are not thrilling to us, it's because these are generated by Frame.io, and there's many reasons why I wouldn't use these, but the most important one is that I am a Premiere user, and you know, the general workflow is I'm going to edit with the original proxies that were created in the camera, or proxies that are created by my assistant editor. I am not going to edit with proxies that Frame.io generated, not only because they are not as good, but because they mux all the audio together in a 2-channel file, and Premiere cannot then later relink quickly and easily to my R3D files. So I would get into a lot more detail than that in the longer class, but that's just something I want to make sure people are aware of. So I'm going to download the ProRes, and then I select the location. So I've set up a folder called Frame.io Camera to Cloud Demo, and these are my Komodo-X downloads, and I click Save, and it immediately begins transferring. You have the option, like I have done, you saw at the beginning, I was stuck on I didn't realize I had my transfer window open. You have the option of downloading from Frame.io a transfer window, and that allows you to batch download all of the files at once. It also allows you to automatically look at what is being downloaded, where it's being put. It's logging the information for you, which I really like. So I recommend downloading the Frame.io transfer. And you know, if that's something in the longer class you guys were interested in, we'd talk about how that works and why to use it and when to use it. So now
we should jump into Premiere.
Into Premiere, exactly. Okay, so inside of Premiere, I want to make some really important points. Inside the project, which I have called Red Frame.io Import, although I have a folder set up and ready to go, Red from Frame.io, you want to access your footage from the media browser. And the important reason why in Premiere you always access it through the media browser is that Red segments a lot of the shots. So for example, if I just show you really quickly what this looks like, I'm just going to show you really quickly that on my actual SSD, if I go into Ariana's interview, for example, what you're seeing is the shot is segmented into all these different files, and the only movie file is that's my proxy that the camera generated, right? And then down at the bottom is the cube, the LUT that I asked for, right? So I don't want to see all these little bits. In Premiere, if you utilize the media browser window, it's going to join all those segments and show you a single shot, right? So I could select those files and import them, and it's automatically going to open them, right? it's going to go ahead and open them as a single file. You're not looking for, wait, what am I supposed to import? There's none of that. So inside the project, again, you know, I could select the folder where I want these to go to the media browser. And what I'm looking for is the Komodo frame IO downloads. And if I go into, Bill's folder's still downloading right now, but if I go into Bill's folder, I'm going to see the proxy movie, and I can actually either open it and view it, or I can import it, and I'm working instantly. I mean, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to start editing with his shot. So the last thing I'll point out in the interest of time, I had mentioned to you, so this is actually a shot from the Raptor, but I had mentioned to you that I always ask for the LUTs, because the way Premiere works, I mean, not only does it read it instantly, but I'm able to, in the Lumetri color, basic color correction panel, there is an input LUT column that allows me to browse for and select and import any of the LUTs that any one of you would give me. I always ask for these. And in fact, knowing this, that how amazing it is to work in Premiere with these, I typically don't need to have my proxies have a burned in look, because I'm able in many cases to utilize the proxies for all of our review screenings, often even audience tests. I'll use the proxies with the LUT applied and have to do zero work. I mean, obviously it also allows everyone on the team and the colorist to know what was actually originally shot or what the intention of the cinematographer was. So I import those LUTs here, and then I select them, and you know, I'm able to apply them and instantly see the different looks that were generated for me. It also works the other direction. I can go into DaVinci and create a LUT, and I do this with my cinematographer, that we then put into the camera. So that, I don't know if that's something you guys ever talk about in the longer class, but I've had a lot of fun playing with this. So I don't really need to have it burned in. If it's burned in, I have a little less control, but for me, I'm going to utilize the LUT that was shot. It's not until we go to a DaVinci colorist at the end of post that we're really going to make a lot of changes to this. It just allows me to edit with something that looks like this instead of that looks like my source.
And you know, I point out that if you're just shooting a Rec 709 and just basing on that, you're not putting in a creative LUT. You can actually download both technical and creative LUTs on the Red download site.
Mm-hmm.
And once you put them into your system, you do exactly what you're doing, but it's like, here's, you know, red wide gamut log 3G10, you know, 2 Rec 709 with, you know, soft contrast, you know, that kind of thing.
And that's
they have a film bias one that I like, and then
and I
you just
love
throw
that,
it on there.
Bill, if you sent me all of those, this is why my list is so long, right? It's like, if I come in here and I want to add, this is why my list is so long. If you want to add a whole bunch at once, like all of the Reds, all of the Alexas, all of the Aries, whatever, from the website, or Bill, if you created some, I would love you to send them to me, and I'd have a list of yours, a list of Beth's, you know, and ultimately they'd be preloaded, but I wouldn't load them one at a time by browsing here. I have a special trick I share in the longer class where you go onto the computer's file folder and load these in all at once. So
yeah, you create a preset.
Yeah, and in the longer course, we can get into that sort of thing more. But I really think I just can't even tell you guys enough how much I love learning from you and how fun it is for me, because it feels like magic if you don't understand the science behind what you're doing in camera. But once post and production start communicating like this, we have so much more fun, and I get to actually preserve and further manipulate your histograms and looks and understand what's going on and communicate with you about, hey, for the next shoot, could we, you know, expose it a little more, or, you know, whatever. I don't have the same language that you cinematographers have, but by doing this work with you, I start to learn your tools. And then I want to share with you mine so that we can really preserve what your intent was creatively, instead of me just cranking on some exposure and contrast down here in the basic color correction tools of an editing app. So I hope you enjoyed that. And, you know, in the longer class, we get pretty deep into this. I could go for 4 hours easily.
Thanks, Christine.
Yeah. So yeah, I think I mean, this is just again, this is a brief overview of Post. And I think people get more confused about Post than they should. It's really like using any other files, if they're coming in, they're coming in flat, so they're flexible, and then, making them, workable. We get into Resolve, we get into color management, and you just, you change some settings, you see everything, you could turn them on and off. So it's much the same way. As people are asking, you do things in Resolve. I do all my work in Resolve now. So I bring them in and I edit it and I just keep it all within the pipeline for me and all my classes. So it's either way you want to go. So I think we want to make sure we've been answering some questions along the way, but we want to make sure we had time to open up to Q&A in general. And then we could, I know we didn't hit everything. Obviously, this is a shortened time span, but we can, showcase some questions, be able to answer as much as we can with the time remaining.
Do we want to do Keaton's video, or are we going to bypass that?
Oh, yes, sorry. Yeah, so let's do Keaton. Everybody come up with your
Don't
questions?
forget the class list too.
What's that?
The class list too.
Yes, the next class. All right, so let me share this. So make sure that this is in large, right? Everybody see this now? So this is Keaton that we saw before. We met in the beginning, and this is him rigging up, doing a sample rigging setup onto his motorcycle.
How's it going, guys? My name is Keaton Bowlby. I own and operate a company called Ascending Works, where we take cameras and rig them to bikes and motorcycles and Russian arms and drones and all of the above. Unfortunately, I can't be there with you today for Reducation, so I wanted to take a quick second and break down how to put a Komodo onto a bike. Let's get into it. All right, to get started, you only need a handful of things. Obviously, you need the Komodo brain. Pick your flavor, Komodo, Komodo-X, Raptor. Right here, we have a Komodo. Around the Komodo, we've got the Ignite Digi Keystone. This is the most versatile rigging tool I've found on the market. It's great for rigging and gimbal work, which is right in my wheelhouse. Out of the Ignite Digi Keystone case, we have the baby pins coming directly out of the sides. They're threaded with 3/8 on the inside. There, we've got a set of Cardellini's, and from there, we've got these 5/8 rods with 4 Mayberry clamps. You can find most of this at your local grip store or get it online somewhere like B&H. I mean, frankly, you could probably make some of this stuff from Harbor Freight. So let's take all the equipment and get it onto the bike. The first step that we're gonna do is these Cardellini clamps and attach them to the front fork of the bike. And you're gonna wanna make sure these are extremely tight when clamping them on, because these are the basis of where your camera is being held. From there, we're gonna take 1 Mayberry clamp and 1 rod, feed that on there and go directly up, also tightening this very tightly. Repeat this on the other side. Once that's done, you're gonna take 2 Mayberry clamps and put them on the sides of the baby pins on the Komodo or your camera. All right, from there, we're gonna slide the camera down on the 5/8 rods with our 2 Mayberry clamps and lock it down. After you feel that all the Mayberry clamps and Cardellini's are locked in, you can then fine tune the angle of the camera. The cool part about this rig is I can flip the camera 180, look at where I'm going, or flip it 180 back and look at how the driver or the rider is looking, or where they're looking, or whatever the action scene calls for. Once again, make sure everything's locked in. I wouldn't go any less rigging than this. Maybe an extra arm here or there would help if you have the room. Obviously, we're kind of limited on this. But go out there, practice, be safe, have fun, and I'll catch you on the next one.
Incidentally, he's using this rig setup for to preview a was it the San Francisco Marathon? So he's going to ride that electric motorcycle with it set up in the point of view and ride the whole course. I think tomorrow after it's over.
I'm glad he didn't lay the bike down, although that would have been cooler visuals.
Yeah. Brian, you're on.
So these are the list of the classes that are upcoming. We have a virtual class next month, which will Bill will be teaching from where he is. Actually, pretty much everybody will be where they're sitting now. We did this kind of made this method during the pandemic, but it turns out it's great for global education because as long as you have a camera on your end, you can follow along the class. It's a 3-day class and we can rent the cameras to you if you don't have one on your end. And then we're going to be in Jackson Hole, Wyoming in September, right before Jackson Wild Film Festival. That one's going to be a little more focused on documentary and nature work, but all the same precepts are the same. We're just shooting, out with moose instead of shooting on the streets of LA. And then LA will have one in October. That's kind of the core class that is going to be held over at Dynamic Rentals. And so those are the next 3 coming up. If you want to join any of them, send me an email. The links are on the website, but they're also available on my Instagram. If you have questions about the classes, email me directly. And then I have a couple of people who I want to bring on stage to ask a couple of specific questions, if you guys are cool with that.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
See if that works. I don't know if it worked. Tried this too. Oh, he didn't want to do it. Okay, so Ivan, so
Yes.
talk about stills for motion.
Yeah. So one of the great things about the RED system. So if you're familiar with the acronym DSMC2 or DSMC, like the Raptor, for example, is DSMC3. This also applies to Komodo and Komodo-X. Digital stills motion camera. So when the camera was first created, it was designed to be 2 tools in one body. And so you have the option to actually use this camera as to acquire motion, or you can acquire stills. In some cases, you can pull stills from the actual motion that you're shooting, but generally what you're doing is much like you would use it with a still camera. You're adjusting your shutter based off of the motion that's happening within the frame. So if you want something that's super tack sharp, you're going to have a higher shutter setting. If you want something that has a little bit more streaks or creamy, then you would go lower in the shutter. And the Komodo-X is actually a 19.9 megapixel sensor. And so you get a lot of information in there. It is 16-bit, so you get a lot of color information as well. And it's pretty easy. I use Red Cine X, and there's a pull stills tool, and you can actually pull a 16-bit TIFF and take that TIFF. That container holds a lot of information. You can take that 16-bit TIFF, you can upload it to Lightroom or Photoshop, whatever, or Capture One, and then you can go in and process that photo just like you would any general still file. What you don't want to do in like Red Cine X, for example, there are tools where you can do a global sharpening. Remember, this camera doesn't have in-camera sharpening like a lot of other cinema cameras. A lot of other cinema cameras have the sharpening that's taking place in camera. With the RED, it doesn't. So you have to actually add your sharpening. And for me, rather than doing a global sharpening, I like to take it into Photoshop or Lightroom and do my secondaries and my isolated sharpening. So it's a very easy process. I've blown up prints. I do a lot of still photography with my RED. It allows you to capture the moment. Also, if I'm on set or if I'm out in the field, we will in pre-production write through, what stills that we want to capture, and then we'll take time during our motion shoot to reset and then shoot 4 stills by adjusting our shutter. It's a great tool. I've blown up prints, 6 feet wide is the widest I've gone.
I wish I was sitting at the studio for this because we have your shot behind us now. The one you gave Jared.
Yeah, the cowboy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, we have that one up in the studio.
Oh, nice. Yeah, and that one is that the viewing distance. I mean, Brian has seen it. The viewing distance on that is really close, so you can actually get up super close to this image and start pixel peeping, and it holds up. It does a really good job. And so with Komodo-X, you're dealing with a 6K sensor, 20 megapixels or 19.9 megapixels, and you're shooting at full 6K at 80 frames per second. And so that's, if you were to shoot a 180-degree shutter at 80 frames per second, that'd be a 160 shutter, which is pretty good. And so you may potentially be able to, especially if you're shooting wildlife at that frame rate, pull some great stills and not have to worry about resetting. Obviously, you can't really have that option in wildlife. You have to be able to pull. Or if you're shooting 4K 120, even a 4K image is going to have a really nice printout. It will be a really nice print. You're limited to size at that point because you're doing 4K, but there's some tricks that you can do in Photoshop that'll actually up-res that image for printing.
Go to
Well,
Ivan's site and
promise-
you'll see a bunch of his photos on the site. I'll make sure I'm lucky enough to have a print in my living room, so I'll bring it down and add it to the set next time. But Red Cine X that he's talking about is a free program that's on the Red site that allows you to do like basic color corrections and things like that. Was meant, it's a good check to see your files and things like that. That's another thing that Ivan will go through a lot more extensively in the longer classes, and how that works, and kind of showing the power behind a raw image and what you're doing with it.
So another question, people are in different environments, so we're not going to try to promote them. But the couple questions about native ISO. I know you went over it a few times, but I know we go over it for 3 days. So because I've heard everyone else's pitch on it, Aaron, how do you address native ISO in a Red camera?
Yeah, I saw a question in there that also addressed how do you make the decision on whether to basically crank the ISO or lower the ISO versus, using NDs. Since the ISO is non-destructive in post, it essentially doesn't really matter. What matters is the aperture and the shutter speed. So what I do typically is I'll set my ISO just at 800, the native ISO, on a Red camera. And then I'm going to choose 180-degree shutter, and then the aperture for the look that I'm going for. Do I want really shallow depth of field, or am I doing an environmental shot where I need to, close down to f11 to get a lot of texture in the foreground and background? So among those considerations, yeah, I mean, I've found these cameras incredible to work with, especially when you compare them to other cameras where the ISO really matters a lot. That's kind of my workflow in the field and how I treat it.
Nice.
Bill, do you want to jump on that too? That was beautiful, whatever just happened in your classroom.
Oh, did we lose Bill?
Look, Bill looks confused. Ivan, go ahead.
Oh,
Yeah.
I had a power blip. All of a sudden, all my lights shut down, but my computer's still on. So I don't even know where that's coming from, but we're still good. Okay.
All right. Yeah, for native ISO, I mean, it's really dependent on the scene because it's not baked in. I'll go from anywhere between 400 ISO and 2000 ISO, depending on the environment that I'm in. Like Bill had mentioned earlier, if I'm in a really low light situation and I need to compose an image with the background, background composition, mid and foreground, then I'll actually kick up my ISO so I can actually see what I'm looking at with my subject in there and compose that way. And knowing that in post I can bring it back down to whatever ISO works for that given scene. And so remember, it's a post effect, or I'm sorry, it's a post exposure tool. And so you're just using it as your exposure adjustment in post. You're not really doing that in camera. So if you left this ISO at 800, you could leave it there at 800 all day long and be perfectly fine in all types of environments. But again, there are some people, I have a good friend of mine down in Australia. He's one of the top commercial cinematographers working right now, and he shoots everything at 320 ISO. And that's even in low light situations, because it forces him to open up and get as much light to that sensor as possible. And that's the way his brain works. And so he wants to have a darker image on his LCD that forces him to open up his iris and get as much light to the sensor as possible. So it's influencing, it's an influencing tool until you get into post, where it's an actual hard technical tool for exposure.
And on the flip side, we have a friend who tells a story about Steven Soderbergh using a higher ISO and making all his decisions based on that, because he wanted that kind of textured noise that ends up, you know, building into it, and is actually, you know, increasing and then putting ND filters on, you know, to create the shallow depth of field and such. And I know that everyone's looking for that native spot. I mean, when you do the defaults and you reset the camera defaults, it will always go to 800. And 800's, you know, on the one hand, it could be very much everyone wants to be at that number, you know, and it gives you latitude both in the highlights and the lowlights. But if you lower it, you actually have more room down in the lowlights. Technically, you don't start to see it a lot, but you know, I tend to stay more on the 500 to 640 just to push myself up a little bit more.
Yeah, and that's a good point with the grain structure, because for me anyway, I really like the grain structure that you get from the red, and there are times when I'll often underexpose so that I can get some of that noise when I'm working with it in post. It just has a really pleasant feel to it. Now, that's not to say you can't break it. You can certainly break it and get digital noise versus more of like a smooth grain structure that's filmic. And so they're, you know, you have to test and see what flavor you like, but you have that option with the camera. So you can be as clean as you want to be for plates, for example, or if you're using some old lenses and you want to add a little bit of kind of, I hate the word organic now, but if you want to add a little bit more of an organic feel, you can actually, or filmic feel, you can actually play with ISO and get that grain. It's a great tool.
So we're coming to the end here. We have a couple minutes left. I don't know if you guys saw anything else in the chat. I know somebody was asking about dead pixels, and I know Dan was turn on that setting and resolve, right?
Yeah, there's also you can turn on one of the tools that will actually help fill in some of those blanks, kind of like, you know, he shows that space clip, you know, where you have infrared radiation causing those dead pixels, and you can actually scale how much it will do, and it will actually fill in some of those spots. So there is a setting for that.
Yeah, generally a black balance will take care of those dead pixels, but I know that there was one question that came up where they actually attempted a black shade and they still had a couple dead pixels in there. And that's where what Bill is talking about in DaVinci Resolve, where it'll actually go through and automatically check those spots and fix the problem.
Somebody asked about wireless live grading. I think that's probably the closest we can get is what you guys just did, right?
Live grading? Ooh.
Yeah, Christine, are you familiar with that? I know that there's some tools out there where you can do live grading. That's dependent on calibrated monitors.
Exactly. I think it's more specific. Like, for example, I've been on a shoot for a concert where they are doing live grading on the fly. I don't know if that's what this person is asking about, or if they're referring to in camera. I'm not sure if they're talking about live grading while you're on set, like live. That's a whole separate discussion that's pretty lengthy. So I'm not sure, Brian, can you get them to clarify, or I'm not seeing that question right now?
I think we're probably going to just run out of time on that one.
Okay.
Yeah, that's pretty in there. I will answer this one. That this is actually a very cool feature. Somebody's asking, it'd be awesome to have in-camera frame grab capability.
Oh, yes.
If you have the app open, Red Control app, you can grab a still of anything you're working on just like that, and will save to your photos on your phone, which I've done several times. So you're getting a still output right on the fly as you're setting up.
But that's
very cool.
not high enough quality, right? That's just a still from your phone.
It's like taking a picture, but you are doing a frame grab. You're not doing it like I'm talking about in camera, but it is a way to do it, and it's
cool.
You know, I've got a setup. Yeah, there it is.
I like that, just to have, I mean, especially for someone like me who's directing and producing, like to take quick setup screenshots on my iPhone. That would be great. But oftentimes after the fact, I'm going back into the footage at 8K and pulling stills from the footage.
Yeah,
and it's a
that's different.
process. At some point, I mean, that's one of my questions is, are they going to make something that makes it really easy for us to do that through Red, through the Red software? I don't know.
Well, there is an app. It's called FoolCat, FOOLCAT. And if you just Google FoolCat Red camera, it'll come up.
Cool.
There's a company, yeah. And what that will do is it'll actually index all of your files. So you'll assign it to a file structure, and then it will go through, and each clip, you'll have all of your metadata. You'll have time of day, all of that information, and then it'll actually give you the first frame from the clip, the middle frame from the clip, and the last frame from the clip. So that way, when you're going back and you're handing off the footage to an editor or assistant editor to log, they can go through and just use this report to find all of it. And it's called FoolCat. It's great.
I just
I'm going to
used
be
it.
checking that out.
I
And here's
just used
why.
it.
Oh, you did?
Yeah. Because Ivan was asking me about it. I said, no, I haven't seen it. And so I contacted them, and then I got a deal, and I got it, and I just used it for a week of shooting in Italy and created PDFs and websites on all the footage. And it doesn't matter if it's Red footage.
Yeah, as long as it's it cataloged all of my drone footage as well, the DJI footage. Yeah.
Nice. Can I mention one last thing about post?
Literally gonna stop in like 30 seconds. So,
Okay, so
hold that for the other class.
for the long class. Well, then I'll
Say-
just add that you can go to those links at www.red.com/reducation.
Thank you, Christine. Thanks, you guys. Really appreciate your time. Thanks for everyone for hanging out for a couple hours. And we'll see you on the next time.
Do you want us to stay on, Brian?
Yeah.
Thanks, guys and gals.
Thanks for coming.
Thanks for everybody
Thanks,
coming.
everyone.
Good questions.